Welcome to Unequal History, where we tell the stories that changed everything. If you love learning about the strange and shocking events that shaped our world, hit that subscribe button right now. Today's story is one you'll never forget, and I promise you've never heard anything like it before. Picture this. You're one of the most powerful people in medieval Germany. You've lived through wars, dangerous politics, and all the scary parts of life in the 1100s. You wake up on July 26th, 1184. Put on your best clothes and get ready for what should be just another meeting with other important people. But today, you're about to die in the most embarrassing way anyone could imagine. On this summer day in 1184, 60 powerful nobles drowned in human waste. And before you think this is a fake story, it actually happened. This is the story of how a political meeting turned into the worst disaster ever. You might wonder how something this extraordinary could actually happen. The answer takes us back to a world so different from yours that it's hard to believe. We're talking about the Holy Roman Empire in 1184, a time when having power meant everything, and one fight could change entire kingdoms. The main characters in our story weren't just any wealthy individuals. They were the most powerful men in Europe, people who owned huge pieces of land and controlled armies that could decide if thousands of people lived or died. At the center of this disaster was Henry VI, King of Germany, a young ruler trying to keep together one of the most complicated political systems in medieval history. Think about how much pressure he felt every single day. Every choice he made could either make his empire stronger or tear it apart completely. He wasn't just dealing with one or two difficult people. He was trying to manage dozens of powerful men who each thought they deserved more land, more power, more respect. It was like trying to keep a room full of hungry wolves from attacking each other. And he was the only one without claws. But Henry had a specific problem that summer. And this problem would lead to one of the most shocking events in all of history. Two of his most important nobles were locked in a bitter fight that could explode into civil war. On one side was Louis III, the Landgrave of Thuringia, a man who had spent his whole life gaining power and wasn't about to let anyone take it away from him. Louis was ambitious, ruthless, and totally convinced that he was right about everything. On the other side stood Archbishop Conrad of Mainz, who didn't just represent political power, but religious authority too. Conrad wasn't just fighting for land. He was fighting for the church's influence in a world where politics and religion were completely mixed together. The fight between these two men had been building for months. It was about land rights, taxes, and the kind of complicated medieval politics that could make your head spin if you tried to understand every detail. But here's what you need to know. Both men had armies. Both had supporters. And both were stubborn enough to fight rather than give up. For Henry VI, this wasn't just a local problem. If these two went to war, it could drag half of Germany into the fighting. Other nobles would be forced to pick sides. Friendships would break, and the stability of the entire empire would be at risk. So Henry did what medieval kings did when faced with such problems. He called a Hoftag, a formal royal court meeting where disputes could be solved through talking rather than fighting. Think of it as medieval diplomacy, a chance for everyone to present their case and hopefully reach a solution that would make both sides happy. The location he chose was Erfurt, a city that was considered neutral ground, somewhere that neither Louis nor Conrad could claim as their own territory. But choosing Erfurt wasn't just about being neutral. The city had become an important trade center, a place where merchants from across Europe came to do business. It was rich, well-connected, and had the kind of impressive buildings that would make visiting nobles feel properly honored. When you're trying to convince powerful men to compromise, the setting matters. You need somewhere that shows respect for their status, while also showing the king's own power and authority. The invitation to this Hoftag went out to dozens of nobles from across the region. These weren't just local landowners or minor officials. We're talking about men who controlled entire provinces, who had the right to collect taxes, raise armies, and make decisions that affected thousands of people. Each of these nobles had their own interests, their own allies, and their own reasons for wanting to see how this dispute would be resolved. Some supported Louis, others favored Conrad, and many were simply there to make sure their own territories wouldn't be affected by whatever decision was made. Now, imagine you're one of these nobles preparing for this gathering. You've spent weeks planning your journey, deciding which servants to bring, which clothes to pack, and how to present yourself at what was basically medieval Germany's most important political event of the year. You're not just attending a meeting, you're taking part in a ritual that has been going on for generations, a formal process that determines how power is shared across the empire. The journey to Erfurt would have been an adventure in itself. Medieval travel was dangerous, uncomfortable, and slow. Roads were little more than dirt paths that turned to mud when it rained. Bandits hid in forests, and even friendly meetings with other travelers could be risky. But for a noble with proper guards and equipment, the journey was also an opportunity to show off wealth and status. Your group would include not just servants and guards, but also the finest horses, the most expensive clothes, and all the symbols of your power and position. As you approached Erfurt, you would have seen a city that was bustling with activity. Merchants were setting up stalls. The building chosen for the Hoftag was a substantial stone structure, the kind of impressive edifice that would be worthy of hosting the most important political figures in the empire. It had been selected not just for its size and grandeur, but also for its symbolic importance. This was where the future of the empire would be decided, where conflicts would be resolved, and where the balance of power would be maintained. The nobles began arriving in Erfurt days before the actual meeting. Each arrival was a carefully choreographed display of power and prestige. Picture the scene. Dozens of the most powerful men in Europe. These weren't just political allies gathering for a friendly discussion. Many of these men had been enemies for years, forced to work together only by their shared loyalty to the crown. Old grievances simmered beneath the surface, and everyone knew that the decisions made in this meeting could affect their lives for years to come. The building itself was typical of medieval construction, built to impress, but not necessarily built to last. Stone walls gave it strength and permanence, but the internal structure relied heavily on wooden beams and supports. The upper floors, where the actual meeting would take place, were designed to accommodate large gatherings, with enough space for dozens of nobles to sit comfortably while conducting their business. But there was a fatal flaw in this building, something that none of the architects, builders, or officials had properly considered. The second floor, where the Hoftag would be held, was directly above the... Now, you have to understand how medieval waste management worked. It wasn't like today, where we have complex sewage systems and treatment plants. Medieval buildings, especially large ones, dealt with human waste in the most basic way possible. They built what were essentially large pits beneath the building, where waste would collect and supposedly decompose over time. This particular building had what seemed like a reasonable solution for its time. A large cesspit had been dug beneath the structure, designed to handle the waste from the building's normal operations. But what nobody had calculated was what would happen when the building was filled to capacity with dozens of heavy-set men in full medieval regalia, all sitting on a wooden floor that was already bearing more weight than it was designed to handle. The morning of July 26, 1184, dawned clear and warm. The nobles began gathering early, each making their way to the designated meeting room on the second floor. Can you imagine the scene? 60 of the most powerful men in medieval Europe, dressed in their finest robes, adorned with symbols of their rank and authority, all filed into a single room to decide the fate of the empire. The air would have been thick with tension, ambition, and the barely contained animosity that had brought them all together. Henry VI took his place at the head of the gathering, ready to begin the delicate process of mediation. Louis III and Archbishop Conrad were positioned according to protocol, surrounded by their supporters and allies. The other nobles arranged themselves according to their own political allegiances and personal relationships. Everyone understood that this wasn't just about resolving one dispute. It was about determining the balance of power for the entire region. As the king began to speak, trying to find common ground between the two feuding parties, nobody noticed the subtle creaking sounds coming from beneath their feet. The wooden floor, never designed to support such concentrated weight, was beginning to strain under the pressure. Medieval construction techniques, while impressive for their time, had significant limitations. The builders had done their best, but they had never anticipated a situation like this. The meeting proceeded according to medieval protocol. Henry VI presented the case from both sides, trying to find a solution that would satisfy everyone involved. The nobles listened, some nodding in agreement, others shaking their heads in disagreement. This was how medieval politics worked, through careful negotiation, compromise, and the constant balancing of competing interests. But as the discussions continued, the structural integrity of the building continued to deteriorate. The weight of 60 heavy men, plus their chairs, plus the normal weight of the building itself, was simply too much for the wooden supports to handle. Small cracks began to appear in the floor, barely visible, but growing larger with each passing moment. Then it happened. Without warning, without any chance for escape or rescue, the floor gave way. In an instant, the entire second floor collapsed, sending 60 of the most powerful men in medieval Europe plummeting into the cesspit below. The sound must have been incredible, a mixture of splintering wood, crashing stone, and the shocked cries of men who suddenly found themselves in the most undignified situation imaginable. Picture the horror of that moment. These men, who had spent their entire lives accumulating power, wealth, and respect, suddenly found themselves drowning in human waste. They were wearing heavy medieval clothing, which would have made it almost impossible to swim, even in clean water. The cesspit was deep, dark, and filled. The cruel irony of the situation was immediately apparent. Henry VI, the man they had all come to see, survived because he had been standing in a different part of the room. Louis III, one of the main disputants, managed to escape because he had been positioned near a wall that remained stable. Archbishop Conrad, the other main disputant, also survived for similar reasons. The three men at the center of the entire controversy lived, while 60 innocent bystanders died in the most horrible way imaginable. The rescue attempts were immediate, but mostly futile. The survivors on the stable parts of the floor tried desperately to help their colleagues, but the situation was hopeless. The pit was too deep, the waist too thick, and the medieval clothing too heavy. One by one, these powerful men who had survived wars, political intrigue, and all the other dangers of medieval life, drowned in sewage. Some of the nobles who fell managed to grab onto pieces of debris or broken beams, fighting desperately to stay above the surface. Others disappeared immediately, pulled down by the weight of their ceremonial robes and the thick consistency of the waist. A few managed to call out for help, but there was little that could be done. Medieval rescue techniques were primitive, and the unique horror of this situation was something that nobody had ever prepared for. The immediate aftermath was chaos. The surviving nobles, those who had been standing in parts of the room that remained stable, were in shock. They had just witnessed something that defied belief. Something so bizarre and horrifying that it would be difficult to describe to anyone who wasn't there. The building's other occupants, servants, guards, and local officials rushed to the scene. But there was little they could do except witness the horror. Word of the disaster spread through Erfurt within hours. The local population, who had been preparing for what should have been a routine political gathering, suddenly found themselves dealing with the aftermath of one of the most unusual disasters in medieval history. The practical problems were immediate and overwhelming. How do you recover 60 bodies from a cesspit? How do you notify their families? How do you even begin to deal with the political chaos that would result from the sudden death of so many important people? The human cost of the Erfurt Latrine disaster was staggering. We're not just talking about 60 random people. We're talking about 60 of the most important political figures in medieval Germany. Each of these men controlled territory, commanded armies, and had families depending on them. Their sudden deaths created a power vacuum that would affect the entire region for years to come. Think about the families of these men. Wives who had sent their husbands off to what should have been a routine political meeting suddenly found themselves widows. Children who had expected their fathers to return with stories of court intrigue instead learned that their fathers had died in the most undignified way possible. The shame associated with such a death was almost as devastating as the death itself. In a culture that valued honor and dignity above almost everything else, dying in sewage was the ultimate humiliation. The political consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Each of the dead nobles had controlled specific territories, and medieval inheritance laws were complex and often disputed. Some of the dead men had clear heirs, others did not. Some had been involved in ongoing legal disputes that would now have to be resolved without their input. The careful balance of power that Henry VI had been trying to maintain was suddenly thrown into chaos. Regional instability followed quickly. Areas that had been under the control of the dead nobles suddenly found themselves without clear leadership. Local officials who had been taking orders from their noble lords suddenly didn't know who they were supposed to report to. Armies that had been loyal to specific nobles found themselves without commanders. The entire political structure of the region was thrown into turmoil. Henry VI found himself in an impossible position. He had called the Hoftag to resolve one dispute, but had instead created dozens of new problems. The original conflict between Louis III and Archbishop Conrad, which had seemed so important just hours before, was now completely overshadowed by the disaster. The king had to deal not just with the immediate crisis, but also with the long-term political ramifications of losing so many key supporters. The medieval chroniclers who recorded this event, this wasn't a glorious death in battle, which medieval culture understood and respected. This wasn't even death from disease or old age, which were accepted as natural parts of life. This was death by drowning in human waste, something so undignified and bizarre that it challenged the very foundations of medieval ideas about honor and nobility. Some contemporary observers interpreted the disaster as divine judgment. In a deeply religious culture, sudden and unusual deaths were often seen as signs of God's displeasure. The question was, what had these men done to deserve such a fate? Were they being punished for their pride, their political ambitions, or their failure to resolve their disputes peacefully? Medieval people looked for moral lessons in every major event, and the Erfurt disaster provided plenty of material for religious interpretation. Here were 60 men who had seemed untouchable, who had controlled vast territories and commanded the loyalty of thousands, and they had been destroyed in a matter of minutes by something as mundane as poor building construction. It was a reminder that no matter how powerful you became, you were still vulnerable to the random disasters that could strike anyone at any time. The architectural implications of the disaster were also significant. Medieval builders had always known that their techniques had limitations, but the Erfurt disaster highlighted just how serious those limitations could be. The idea that a building could collapse under the weight of its intended use was sobering, and it led to changes in construction practices. The disaster forced people to reconsider the basic assumptions about building design and safety that had been taken for granted. But perhaps the most profound impact of the disaster was psychological. The men who survived, particularly Henry VI, Louis III, and Archbishop Conrad, had to live with the knowledge that they had escaped death purely by chance. They had been in the same room, attending the same meeting, but had survived while their colleagues died. This kind of survivor's guilt was something that medieval culture wasn't well equipped to handle. The families of the dead nobles also had to cope with a form of grief that was complicated by shame and confusion. How do you mourn someone who died in such an undignified way? How do you honor the memory of a man who drowned in sewage? Medieval funeral practices were designed to celebrate the achievements and honor of the deceased. But the circumstances of these deaths made traditional mourning rituals seem inadequate. The political ramifications continued for years. The power vacuum created by the disaster led to a series of succession disputes, territorial conflicts, and political realignments that affected the entire region. Some of the dead nobles had been key supporters of Henry VI, and their loss weakened the king's position considerably. Others had been important mediators in regional disputes, and their absence made future conflicts more likely. The original dispute between Louis III and Archbishop Conrad, which had brought everyone to Erfurt in the first place, was never properly resolved. The disaster had made it seem trivial by comparison, but the underlying issues remained. The two men continued their conflict, but it was now overshadowed by the larger political chaos created by the disaster. In the months following the disaster, Henry VI struggled to maintain control of his empire. The loss of so many key supporters had weakened his position, and rival claimants to the throne began to see opportunities for advancement. The careful balance of power that had existed before the disaster was gone, and it would take years to rebuild. The disaster also had broader implications for medieval political culture. The idea that important political meetings could be dangerous in themselves was new and disturbing. Previously, the main risks associated with medieval politics had been warfare, assassination, and disease. The possibility that you could die simply by attending a meeting in a poorly constructed building had never been seriously considered. This led to changes in how and where political gatherings were held. Building inspections became more common, and there was greater attention paid to the structural integrity of meeting places. The practice of holding important gatherings in upper floors of buildings was reconsidered, and many future meetings were held in ground floor rooms or in specially constructed temporary structures. The legacy of the Erfurt Latrine Disaster extended far beyond the immediate political consequences. It became a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, the instability of earthly power, and the importance of practical considerations in political planning. Medieval chroniclers use the story to illustrate moral lessons about humility, the fickleness of fortune, and the ultimate equality of all people in the face of death. The disaster also highlighted the interconnectedness of medieval society. The death of these 60 nobles affected not just their immediate families, but also the thousands of people who depended on them for protection, employment, and servants lost their positions. Soldiers lost their commanders, and entire communities found themselves without their traditional leaders. The economic impact was also significant. Many of the dead nobles had been involved in trade relationships, land agreements, and financial arrangements that were suddenly thrown into question. Their deaths created legal disputes that took years to resolve, and the uncertainty affected economic activity throughout the region. The story of the Erfurt Latrine Disaster spread throughout medieval Europe, becoming one of the most well-known examples of sudden and unexpected death. It was retold in chronicles, used in sermons, and became part of the collective memory of medieval political culture. The story served as a reminder that no matter how powerful or important you became, you were still subject to the same random disasters that could affect anyone. But what can we learn from this strange and terrible event? The Erfurt Latrine Disaster teaches us several important lessons about human nature, political power, and the unpredictability of life. First, it reminds us that the most powerful people in society are not immune to random disasters. No amount of wealth, political influence, or social status can protect you from the basic dangers of being human. Second, it illustrates the importance of practical considerations in political planning. The organizers of the Hoftag had paid careful attention to the political and ceremonial aspects of the gathering, but had failed to consider the basic structural integrity of the building. This oversight had catastrophic consequences, and it serves as a reminder that even the most important political events can be derailed by seemingly mundane practical problems. Third, the disaster highlights the interconnectedness of political systems. The death of these 60 nobles didn't just affect their immediate families. It destabilized the entire political structure of the region. This shows us how dependent medieval society was on individual leaders, and how the loss of key figures could have far-reaching consequences. The story also illustrates the medieval understanding of death and dignity. For these nobles, the manner of their death was almost as important as the fact of their death. Dying in battle was honorable. Dying of old age was natural. But dying in sewage was shameful. This tells us a lot about medieval values and the importance of maintaining honor and dignity, even in death. Finally, the Erfurt Latrine Disaster serves as a reminder of the importance of building safety and engineering competence. Medieval builders did their best with the knowledge and materials available to them, but they were working with significant limitations. The disaster shows us what can happen when those limitations are not properly understood or respected. The story of the Erfurt Latrine Disaster is ultimately a story about human vulnerability. These 60 men had achieved everything that medieval society valued: power, wealth, influence, and respect. But in the end, they were just as vulnerable to random disaster as anyone else. Their deaths remind us that no matter how successful we become, we are all subject to the same basic uncertainties of human existence. The disaster also serves as a commentary on the nature of political power itself. Medieval politics was a dangerous game where the stakes were always high and the consequences of failure could be severe. But the Erfurt disaster shows us that sometimes the greatest dangers come not from your enemies or your political rivals, but from the most mundane and unexpected sources. In the end, the Erfurt Latrine Disaster stands as one of the most bizarre and tragic events in medieval history. It was a disaster that nobody could have predicted, that nobody could have prevented, and that nobody could have survived through skill or preparation. It was simply a random tragedy that struck at the heart of medieval German politics. changing the course of history in ways that are still being felt today. So the next time you attend a meeting, whether it's at work, school, or anywhere else, remember the story of the Erfurt Latrine Disaster. Remember that 60 of the most powerful men in medieval Europe died because nobody bothered to check if the floor could support their weight. Remember that even the most important political events can be derailed by the most basic practical problems. And remember that no matter how powerful or important you become, you are still subject to the same random disasters that can affect anyone at any time. The Erfurt Latrine Disaster teaches us that life is unpredictable, that power is temporary, and that dignity can be lost in an instant. But it also teaches us that even in the face of the most bizarre and terrible disasters, life goes on. The political system recovered, new leaders emerged, and the memory of those who died was preserved in the stories that people tell. In the end, perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. That even the most undignified death can become part of a story that teaches us something important about being human. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's strangest disasters. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and let me know in the comments what other bizarre historical events you'd like to hear about. And don't forget to subscribe to Unequal History for more stories that will change how you think about the past. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that at least you don't have to worry about medieval toilets.